Hello, Year 11s. As promised, to help with your revision, I'm going to be doing a podcast this evening on Eva Smith / Daisy Renton. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give an overview of the character, and then I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail how her relationship between the other members of the cast. Dropping in a few quotes about her, obviously, because that's important that you try and remember some of that evidence. Your essay question is looking at Eva Smith, so what I'm saying should be quite helpful, although obviously it won't be structured in the essay format that you want to do with your language analysis, writer's methods, etc. So Eva can be seen as a representative of all the sort of poor, disadvantaged women in society, and we get that first clue from her surname. The name Smith is the most common name in the UK. So she really symbolises everyone there of her class who's suffering. Since we never actually have her on stage, we never hear from her directly, it's very tricky to talk about her as a character in the same way that you can do the other characters in the play, Burling, Gerald, etc. So what we learn about her, we learn through everyone else. A lot of that mainly is Gould, who has her diary and things like that, supposedly. So we've got some basic information about the last 2 years of her life. Firstly, she worked hard for Burling Company, but went on strike due to unfair pay. This was quite similar to the behaviour of lots of coal miners and other workers who were striking for better pay and better conditions. And Mr. Burling himself even admits that she was actually a good worker, which goes to show really how unfair the society was there, that she was still completely irrelevant for him, even though he admits she was good. So we also know she was quite attractive. She was pretty enough to make Sheila jealous, who then got her sacked from her next job. And we know she attracted the attentions of Gerald and Eric and the other chap in the bar. We also know that she has some morals, despite perhaps reasons not to. So he kind of Priestley really juxtaposes her with the Burling family, who at the start of the play don't seem to have any morals at all. Eva refuses to marry Eric and refuses money from him when she finds out it's stolen. She's strong and courageous, where she demands for a pay rise. But be careful not to talk about when the scene in the film where he offers her a promotion, and she turns it down. That doesn't happen. So be careful, okay? Don't be too faithful to the film. She does reach some low points where she's working in the Palace Theatre bar, and there's a suggestion that perhaps she might be leading towards prostitution, and of course her eventual suicide when pregnant with Eric's baby. I think Priestley uses Eva as a way of making the Burlings realise the effect their actions have on an individual, and he wants to do that because of the fact that the family are a microcosm of society. So I've talked about this quite a lot, and what that phrase means is that Priestley uses this as one of his methods to show on a small scale what he thinks or about things on a much bigger scale. So he uses this Burling family, he uses Eva Smith and the treatment that they give of Eva to represent what was really happening in the UK, in particular at the time when it's set, obviously much earlier than when it's written, and he obviously is using that as a warning. He doesn't want things to go back to that. So by making them realise the effects their actions have on an individual, I guess it's kind of hopeful that they will treat people better. We don't really even know if Eva Smith and Daisy Renton are the same person, and we don't know whether the inspector has pictures of different girls and this is his way of sort of tricking the family. He fiercely controls the situation and is very strict, doesn't let Gerald have a look at the image, and he says that he likes to use this line of questioning. Remember that your reference to the text can be talking about specific things like that. You don't need to necessarily know loads of quotes off by heart. ultimately it's completely irrelevant, because it doesn't matter whether the actions were done to the same person or not. They're still to blame for their actions. So we do doubt who Eva is and whether or not she could be multiple people, whether she's actually committed suicide. It's not really the point of his story. His story is not about just the tragic death of one young girl. It's a message of social responsibility. And it doesn't matter who that person is, male, female, rich or poor. Everyone should be treated fairly and with respect. Overall, Eva can be seen as a victim of other people's selfishness. And we're going to go, as I said, into a bit more detail of how she affects the other characters. I'm really sorry, my dog is barking in the background, so let me just pause. Sorry, I'm back. Some of the ways in which she's described as a pretty girl. She's described pretty, lively girl who never did anybody no harm, but she died in misery and agony, hating life. So that's part of what the inspector says when he's using lots of emotive words there, misery and agony, which really juxtaposes how she obviously is considered to be pretty and warm-hearted. We know that she drank some disinfectant and again died after several hours of agony. And disinfectant, I don't know if I'm reading too much into this, but, you know, it gets rid of germs in the same way that she kind of maybe wants to get rid of everything, every way in which she's been wronged, and every like nasty, horrible, dirty thing that's happened to her. That could be just me being an English teacher, but that might be a nice little symbol. And then also when we hear the inspector and Sheila talking about this famous quote, you know, the one that you must all remember, the fire and blood and anguish, she really represents that in the way that she goes out. And it also foreshadows, obviously, the war. There's lots of things that you can talk about there. Now, the name, I've already talked about Smith, but then Eva is like Eve, which again is like the original woman. And so this just does kind of go to show how she is a symbol of women in society. The Smith gives us the working class aspect, but then the name woman, that, you know, she is the original woman, just goes to show how she kind of is representing them all there. So we talk about Eva and Mr. Burling first. Some quotes, he said, "I told the girl to clear out." So we've got use of girl and clear out here in that quote, shows how unimportant. She's very low down on this hierarchy, you know, barely a blip on his radar. She's referred to as wretched girl, constant references to her being girl. Again, it's very belittling, you know. It's, you know, even though she was a young woman. Later on, after she's been sacked, she stopped being Eva Smith. This is when she takes the name of Daisy Renton, and Inspector Gould says perhaps she'd had enough of it. So this name change might foreshadow the eventual suicide as well. Just this exhaustion, this need to change identity, need to stop being this person. So Eva and Sheila then, and then we've got a quote on, so that after 2 months, ... she was feeling desperate. And she was very desperate when after she's sacked from Millwoods. Sheila, of course, is one of the characters that feels really, really guilty for what she does to Eva, which is really nice. And I think on some level it's almost like woman to woman, she can understand her situation a lot more. And obviously we've got the youth and the fact that the younger generation were meant to be that hope for the future that Priestley's trying to say. So how Eva then relates with Gerald. Well, we've got this quote: "She decided she might as well try another kind of life." And this is sort of a euphemism for the fact that she was reduced to considering prostitution, which would have made her feel completely worthless, but she'd been sacked from her 2 previous jobs and was really running out of options. We know she didn't have any family. Gerald describes her as young, fresh and charming. All she wanted was to talk, a little friendliness. So those are some quotes there, ways and things that you can remember. Again, really positive, really warm descriptions. And at this point, she wanted to be Daisy Renton and not Eva Smith. I think she confides a lot in Gerald. And she was grateful to him, obviously, and perhaps fell in love with him. Obviously, it doesn't work out between the two, and Eva is back to square one. So, Eva and Mrs. Burling then. When we're getting to this part of the story, we've obviously figured out that there's a bit of a recurring trend here, that everyone around this dinner table is in some way going to have something to do with this poor girl. So Mrs. Burling, who's remained very sure about herself and her lack of involvement, setting herself up for the fail. Obviously, we've got really good use of dramatic irony here, where we as the audience, we know what to expect, we know what's going to happen, we know that she is going to be responsible, because that's the structure that Priestley has used, where he's had a character interrogated and sort of brought down. So we know that's going to happen, because that's just that's what's happened so far. But she's very adamant, and when she's talking, her involvement is that she doesn't give Eva any money when she really needs money, because she's pregnant. And funnily enough, like we've the narrative has been quite chronological so far. We've talked, we've had Mr. Burling, the sacking at the beginning, and then the Millwards, and then Gerald, and things are going in quite a nice order. But it actually does a little bit of a jump here, where with Sybil Burling, where we've got almost the final nail in the coffin before we get to the character of Eric. So spoiler alert, although if you do not know this yet, then I'm seriously concerned. But Eric obviously impregnates Eva, and then it's at this stage where she has absolutely no options and goes to try and get help from Sybil Burling, Mrs. Burling's charity. And there she is refused for a number of reasons. She goes in and she refers to herself as Mrs. Burling, which is quite unusual. And obviously Mrs. Burling gets her back up a little bit. Eva went to the committee to ask for help when she's pregnant, and this was the last possible sort of hope for her. The quote here is, "She'd been turned out and turned down too many times." She's lost hope. She's really not had any luck. And instead of helping her as charity does, we hear this word charity and it has such positive connotations, but in this instance it's almost made so much worse, because you expect it to help, you expect this final little shred of hope, ray of sunshine, and because it doesn't, it makes things so much worse for her. Mrs. Burling, of course, ironically, says that the whole responsibility is on the father. She says that the father of the child was, quote, silly and wild and drinking too much. So she thinks that she should have nothing to do with it. This is the man's responsibility. Again, so, we've got a real reflection there of the patriarchal society. Why can't a woman help another woman out? It's not necessarily the man's job. Patriarchal society, for those who don't know, is one where the society is run by the men. They are superior. So then, of course, lastly, we've, most of the audience and, of course, Sheila have guessed that whilst Mrs. Burling is on her high horse about the man needs to take care of it, and who is this wretched, guy that's impregnated this woman, and she wants nothing to do with it. Of course, that we then have the kind of reality of the fact that the last person to be questioned, the last one around the table, the irresponsible young son of the Burlings, Eric, is of course then the father of this baby. So as I said, this is a really, really clever structure that he's used there, where he just swaps around the last two from the chronological order, so that we get that crushing realization when Sybil realizes that her son is this reprobate that she's had her nose turned up to. It's kind of quite a clever way in which he's done that. Really puts her in her place when she's been such a bit of a cow about everything. So Eve and Eric then. Eva meets Eric in the same palace bar. Similar situation to Gerald. He says that he talks about their first instance of meeting, and it seems like it wasn't particularly a nice one. He seems like he forced himself on her. And Eva becomes pregnant with Eric's child. Eva there is very sensible, and actually she's a lot more sensible and mature than Eric, which I think kind of reflects how different, even though they're probably similar ages, how different her experience, her upbringing was to him. He's been quite sheltered. He's faced very different challenges to certainly those that Eve would face. Obviously, he's got expectations on his shoulders, and he doesn't seem to be enjoying his life an awful lot, but I don't think there's any way in which he could have grown up in the same way and grown up as fast as her. So she's a lot more sensible. She knows that she doesn't want to accept this stolen money. And she's really desperate. And she was quite noble in not telling Mrs. Burling about the father of the child. She obviously wanted to protect him, when really she didn't owe him anything. So I think the audience have so many opportunities in this play to warm to this character that they never even meet, which is quite special. I think that Priestley is able to do that. So we just have a little look at the end of the play then. Each of you helped kill her. Gould lays the blame for her death firmly at the feet of this family. It's something called collective responsibility, and again, it's representative of social problems. She wanted to end her life. She felt she couldn't go on any longer. That's a direct quote about how she gives up in the end, and she sees death as her only option. She's already changed jobs, changed her name. And then lastly, Eva Smith's gone. You can't do her any more harm, and you can't do her any good now either. But then this is where we get the real point of Priestley. And it's towards the end where he says, one Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, with their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness, all intertwined with our lives, with what we think and say and do. We are responsible for each other. Okay, so you don't need to remember that whole quote, but I would like the millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, or even just the repetition of millions, things like that. So you don't need to remember these huge long quotes, but if you can remember the part where Gould recognises, that this is a much bigger problem with his use of millions, you're getting your references in there, and you're getting those AO2 marks, which is, the aim of the game. So lastly, it's about how she extends to society as a whole. And some people are aware of that. Sheila has learnt her lesson, so has Eric. Whereas the elder generation, their conversation is a lot more focused on public scandal and trying to figure out if they've actually been had. She's referred to as the dead girl by the older generation, which kind of shows how they've missed the point completely there. But on the whole, she has been a symbol for the audience. And how the play ends again, where they think that they've found out that the whole thing was a hoax, but Sheila's still feeling awful. She says we still did these things. And then we get the phone call that a girl has just died on her way to the infirmary after swallowing some disinfectant. And we don't know then maybe if Eva Smith was some sort of ghost, or, some sort of sign, whether Ghoul was a ghost. The whole thing is a bit crazy, and it just makes the audience confused, but that's the point. You're not meant to know who she was. You're not meant to know if she was 1 or 4 or 5. It's about how you treat people. So how you treat Eva, and in our, we have our own Eva Smiths. It's about how we look after people in our society. That's who she is. That's her function. Treat people badly and bad things will happen. Fire and blood and anguish, agony. These are the words that are being used to show this downfall of this character who actually we really warm to. Okay, so oh gosh, that was way longer than I hoped. Sorry, that was meant to be short, brief, but hopefully that was quite helpful. Good luck with your essay, and I shall see you all soon.